Yeah.
But what else can we do to really change this perspective?
You heard about the Christian woman in Sudan who was sentenced to death because of her faith.
So whose interests are actually served in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Because they fund many of the most notorious movements out there that are leaders of terrorism and strange things.
From your perspective, we're all listening to what's good and what's bad, and there's much more bad than there's good. What is there to be hopeful about?
And we see the leader of the group who, by all measures, is a lunatic.
It has really filled my mind with some comfort and a stronger desire to learn more.
But that is constant indoctrination.
The enemy is human nature. The enemy, perhaps, is something we can't change.
Because they sent, with the mosque, they sent a lot of teachers. And those teachers taught Wahhabi Islam, which is so intolerant of anybody.
The ordinary Muslim thought, because we know what the ordinary Christian thought. And I think that's exactly what you're telling us.
There was an ugly massacre of 70,000 people. Ironically, not all the people who were killed were Muslims. There were many East Orthodox Christians.
Do you think it would help in news reporting if they started referring to Wahhabi Islam and then just Islam?
You know, and all of us are going to hell except for them.
Were Muslim Chinese who were attacking. And I'm just curious if this is more a tribal issue.
I was there. There were absolutely no demonstrations. A lot of people came to get a car out of the ditch.
Hello and welcome. My name is Khalid Sharafuddin from Islamic Media. I see a lot of new faces and a lot of faces from the last event. This is our 5th event. If you have missed them, we've had one about Islam, one about jihad, one about Sharia law, one about the differences between Sunni and Shia, and this one, world conflicts from an Islamic perspective. I'm not going to talk much, so I'll try to keep it short and sweet. If you have any questions, you can ask Dr. Odeh Muhawesh when the QA session starts. I'm just going to go through the folder quickly, even though they are self-explanatory, all the materials here. So in a few minutes, Dr. Odeh Muhawesh will do his presentation, and then we'll do the Q&A at 1 o'clock or so. And then we'll have the lunch. I have one here is about us. We get asked that question all the time, so we said we'll add this to the folder about us. And this is the most important paper here. This one is like almost empty. It's got 2 lines. Please fill those if you have the time. We don't shy away from any criticism. If anything missing, we would love your feedback. This is how we do our events. We build on the prior events, making them better and better. So be generous with us and give us all the feedbacks you have. We'd really appreciate it. And this is resources, front and back, about Islam material, if you want to read further. And the business card. If you haven't had one, we should have extra by the table there. And the last material is these. I hope everyone got to have the name tag. Sometimes they slip from the clip. And 2 white papers for extra things to write. I see a lot of excitement there. Not. And we have these 3 leaflets. One about Islam rightly explained. This is done in town, not downloaded from a website. This is done in town by 2 authors. One of them is going to be here, hopefully today. And was about Muhammad. And one, why do Muslims have a dress code? That's all I have. Without any further ado, Dr. Odeh Muhawesh.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you. It's, I think, 84 degrees now outside and humid, so if nothing else, it's nice and cool in here, right? It's great to see many of your faces again, and great to see a lot of new faces. As I was driving here today, I was reminiscing about some of the trips that we took around the state of Minnesota after long winters, especially this winter. And this year, the news is that we have a much worse year than previous years when it comes to mosquitoes and horseflies. How many of you guys heard that? Do you know it's a fact, actually? You know how I know it's a fact? CNN said so. So that is the world that we deal with. We take our information from our surroundings. We develop sources that, even though, I bet if I talk to each one of you individually, if I would ask you the question, do you trust CNN? I don't think there would be anybody who would say, I trust CNN completely, or Fox News, or NBC, or ABC, CBS, or other news sources. So, but we don't have time. Many of us are not experts in the media, are not experts in the authenticity of information that we have. We are not experts in politics. We are not experts in everything. We're experts in our fields. And we do a good job at our areas of expertise. So how do we sort through all of this information? How do we make sure that the judgments that we have, because we do pass judgments about our surroundings, about the world, about any issue that we deal with, how do we know that those judgments are correct? The truth is, absolute truth is not monopolized by anyone. Absolute truth, anybody who says that they know the absolute truth completely are misleading themselves. No one does. But as groups, we do develop a collective opinion. Irish, the American Irish, they have some views of the world. Scandinavians, they all believe that lutefisk is good, right? Doctors have views about traditional medicine or professional medicine. Our lawyers have views. All those are collective groups. Christians have opinions about the world. Muslims do, Buddhists, Hindus. It doesn't matter how you look at society, there is always a collective opinion that we form. Now, within the collective groups, within these groups, there are diverse opinions about the interpretation of those opinions, the interpretation of world events, the interpretation of scripture, interpretation of politics, political issues. And Muslims are like everybody else, 1.6 billion Muslims. They have a collective feeling about what goes on in the world. Yet within the Muslim communities, and there are many different opinions about same subjects. Many of them are theological, political, economic, cultural, any way you look at it. One of the common characteristics of Muslims in general is that they feel that they're under attack now. And this started from the time of the Crusades. The Crusades changed completely the way Muslims look at the world. Regardless of the factors which led to the initiation of the Crusades and the killings that happened and the many massacres that happened, in 1049, there was a massacre in Jerusalem that is the basis, I can say, for how Muslims in general look at every single event today. It was an ugly massacre of 70,000 people. Ironically, not all the people who were killed were Muslims. There were many East Orthodox Christians, many Jews who get killed in the city of Jerusalem. Yet the Muslims are the ones who have formed their opinion and their feelings about world events from that day on. Why? Because the Ottoman Empire was formed immediately after that, became a superpower, and really defined, for the most part, how Muslims should view the world. That Muslims should view the world as the world against us. Christians of Europe who want to kill all Muslims. They want to occupy our lands, regardless of what the justification or the facts were. I happen to disagree with that notion because it wasn't all Christians, and I happen to understand that the motives, the true motives between the Crusades, were not purely Christian. If they were purely Christian, they wouldn't have killed a lot of Christians, for one thing. But it doesn't matter. What matters is that that is what has been taught from that day and is still taught until this day in the Muslim world in one format or another. So the Muslim world looks at everything, especially the West, with a great eye of suspicion, mistrust. Now, post-Ottoman, the Ottoman Empire was taken apart by England, France, and started out with Portugal. Then the US got into the fray towards the end of it. And in the process, there were many, many different events that shaped the relationship between the collective Muslim world with the West. When you talk about the West, the West is diverse by itself, but Muslims view the West as one unit, one entity that is driven by Christian zeal to annihilate anybody who is not Christian. Now, I know you're thinking in the back of your mind, this is not fair, it's not true. I'm telling you what is, not what is fair and what's true. This is the reality that we deal with. And I understand the opposite side of this, how the West views the Muslim world and views the conflicts, because I came when I was 18, and I went to schools here, I live here, I am a Minnesotan, I'm an American, and I'm proud of that. So I see how the other side of the story is. In all of this, what is true, but might not be the absolute truth, what is true is that any event that we study, any event that we hear about, whether it is news or history, there are a lot of information that is kept from each side. I am not going to get into whether it's deliberate or not, but it's kept from any news story. That omission changes the whole story. That omission of information changes our perspective on everything. I will start by telling you an example of a story that happened to me when I was at seminary in the Middle East, in Iran specifically. There was one day where we finished classes, came out of class, somebody was driving their car, Iranian-made car, across a dry riverbed, and the axle broke. I was an eyewitness to this story. I participated in the story that I'm going to tell you about. So everybody get together. I know a lot of you are familiar with how the Italians are, loud but loving, and all come together to help each other, right? You know, Iranians are really not too far from that. So everybody got together, and everybody started, praising the Lord and helping, and picked up the car, moved it across, and from what I remember, several hundred people at least got together. I stood there. I wish I could have helped, but there were too many people. I walked back to my house from class, from that event, which probably would have taken me about 7 minutes. Now it would take me 15 minutes because I'm older and I can't do it in the same amount of time, right? And then I turned on my shortwave radio. Do you have any young people here who have no idea what a shortwave radio is? Oh, you don't, right? It's a really great invention, but we don't have them anymore. So I turned on my shortwave radio, and I used to listen to the BBC. Breaking news on the BBC in the city of Qom, where I was. Massive demonstrations against the government. I was there. There were absolutely no demonstrations. A lot of people came to get a car out of the ditch, and there was absolutely no political spin to it. No political dimension to that event whatsoever. So sometimes we take the news and we just spin it completely to serve a purpose. Sometimes we eliminate or omit some pieces of information. Take for story, for example, how many of you have heard about Maryam Ibrahim? Just one? How many of you heard about the Christian woman in Sudan who was sentenced to death because of her faith? more people. Okay? Her name is Maryam Ibrahim, Mary, the daughter of Abraham. Beautiful name, right? So when we hear about this story, and I'll tell you for those of you who haven't heard about it, in Sudan, this is the news that we hear about here. In Sudan, there is a woman, a Christian woman, who is married, has two children, has one child, and she's pregnant with another one. And the court in Sudan sentenced her to death because she chose to become Christian. Now, this is really upsetting. When I first heard it, I was absolutely outraged. I'll tell you why I was outraged. Not because of only the injustice that would be carried out against that woman, but also because I know my faith. I'm an expert in my faith. I'm an expert in theology. I'm a theologian. And I know Islam doesn't condone such a thing. And I'll explain this, by the way, for those of you who are curious about it, because I know we have a number of theologians. So I started digging into the story. I know professors in Sudan. I have students who are in Sudan. I have many friends who are in Sudan, and I really wanted to get behind the scenes of this story. Now, I found out this woman was actually born and raised a Christian. Her father was born a Muslim, but he wasn't a Muslim. He didn't practice Islam, as many people in the West would be viewed as Christian, while in reality, none of us would call them Christian. They probably would not call themselves Christian. The Muslim world has a lot of those too. So somehow the judge, after she had one child who's 2 years old, has been married to her husband for all this time, the judge decided that, well, she is a heretic and we need to kill her. It bothered me, this story, because I know in Islam, women, all the laws of apostasy, women are absolutely excluded. And it bothered me because why would a story like this woman who has been living with her husband all this time, why would a judge decide that that's what they want to do now? There is more to the story than CNN shares with us. More to the story than the BBC shares with us. Africa is the hotbed of future conflicts. Keep your eyes on Africa. China has went into Africa several years back. China built factories, bought the rights to a lot of land, sent economic aid. They are all over Africa because China wants Africa's resources, and Africa has a lot of resources, and it's a beautiful continent if you haven't been there. The future or the current conflicts that we hear in Africa started with, of course, Rwanda, South Africa, those are old, but the current ones really were, the highlight of them was Darfur. So in Darfur, what we heard is that people are killing each other, and if you dug into the story, it's Arabs killing Africans. And some of the news said it's Muslims killing Christians. Well, the truth is, all the people of Darfur, except probably for very few travelers, are Muslim. And the truth is, it's a tribal war that has existed for thousands of years between people in Darfur. Why did we pay attention to Darfur all of a sudden, and we were always, all of a sudden, the world really cared about what's going on in Darfur? I can guarantee you what is going on in Darfur has gone on for a long time and goes on in many, many other places in the world. Why don't we care? Well, when we know that Darfur has the largest water aquifer in North Africa, we know that things change. Our motives really change. In one of the comments that people made on what's going on in Nigeria, about which I'll speak in a second, somebody said, "Oh God, we really need to go and help, but I pray to God that we don't find oil on our way there." We always have motives for what we do. That's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. It's that the only bad thing is that when we pretend to say that we care, but we really don't care about the human element of all of this. Look at what's going on in Nigeria, a beautiful, powerful country, the second largest economy in Africa, the most powerful army, arguably, in Africa, an army that is actually a peacemaker in Africa. They have a lot of forces all over Africa. And all of a sudden we hear about a group that's called Boko Haram that is doing absolutely outrageous things. And we see the leader of the group, who, by all measures, is a lunatic. If you watch some of his videos, really, he is a lunatic. He's either on some form of drugs, and I'm not being funny, or he is a complete ignorant idiot that is being manipulated by somebody else. All of a sudden we hear about Boko Haram, and all of a sudden we hear about 200 girls who he says he converted to Islam, and now they're reciting the Quran. That is very outrageous, and it is truly outrageous what he is doing. And we have tried, many people have tried to bring attention to the conflict in Nigeria, including the US in 2011. The US got involved to try to solve the problem, or that's how I would like to think. I know many of you think that I'm critical of America. I'm not. I love America. I'm critical of our foreign policy, very critical of our foreign policy. The Nigerian government, 2011, decided to put its army against this small group, Boko Haram, and just completely put an end to it. The US government threatened the Nigerian government with economic sanctions if they do so. How many of you don't believe me? Honestly. It's true. The US government threatened the Nigerian government with economic sanctions if the Nigerian government put an end to the Boko Haram phenomenon. I know it's confusing. Why the heck would we do that? It doesn't make sense. And now, of course, we're talking about sending troops, and we indeed have 100 soldiers, Marines, in Chad, and 1,000 Marines are heading to Libya. Why? To help bring our girls back. How sad it is that these kidnappings have gone on for a long time. Chinese experts, 8 of them, are still in captivity in Nigeria. We didn't hear about anybody saying this is not fair, let's go get them out. Many other people. A Nigerian prince was assassinated there. Many mosques were blown up. Many churches were blown up. It didn't seem that any of that bothered us. The kidnapping of girls in Nigeria has gone on for a long, long time, and many girls have been sold to slavery in Africa because of these groups, Boko Haram and others. Why is it that we pay attention all of a sudden, and why would our government get involved and say you cannot finish off Boko Haram? I'll come back and answer that question because there is a very, very good answer to this question. Next, close to Nigeria, 2 states moved to the east, is the Central African Republic. Central African Republic, how many of you heard about the conflict that's going on there? What is going on there? Anybody? Volunteer. Put your hands up. Did you?
It's a tribal conflict. Doesn't understand it. I don't understand the nature of the tribes.
But what's going on there? Does anybody know? What is going on is there is an army of militia, of Christian militias, that is killing the 15% Muslim population. They're killing children. They're killing girls. Muslims escape to Catholic churches for safe haven. If it wasn't for Catholics in the Central African Republic, there is genocide. The United Nations actually said there is ethnic cleansing in the Central African Republic. It doesn't make it to our headline news here. It's done in the name of God. It's done in the name of Christ. And Christ has nothing to do with this. We know this. But I'm leading you towards how Muslims feel about all of this stuff. In South Sudan, there is a conflict that's going on. And a lot of people are dying. People are killed in churches and mosques. And by the way, people go to churches and mosques because of 2 reasons. They believe that they will be safe there, that other people will respect places of worship. And they are usually the most well-funded structures in those poor countries. Muslims and Christians, shame on us for building these big, massive buildings while people are starving there. But at least when they use them as sanctuary, militias are going into churches and mosques and killing people inside the places of worship. The army of God in South Sudan, which proclaims to be a Christian army, is killing whom? It's not killing Muslims. It's not killing Christians. It's killing pagans, people who are different than them. They're killing them based on tribal divide. The people who are Christian come from certain tribes. The people who are pagan come from certain tribes. And these guys form an army, and unfortunately they call it the army of God, and they're killing pagans. These stories are not sorted out for us so that we understand them. You have to work hard to really dig behind the story. Just last week, BBC had an interview with the president of South Sudan, a major who looks very, very rough. And the interviewer was asking him very tough questions. He said, your people are dying. You have a famine there. And he said, I acknowledge this. He said, will you step down? He said, maybe I'll step down at the end of the day. I don't remember what his answer was. He said, will you hold elections? He said, go and ask the Americans. He said, what do you mean go and ask the Americans? He said, we wanted to hold elections, and John Kerry told me, this is on the BBC, go to the BBC site and look for the archive, you will see it. And John Kerry said, don't even dare think about elections. We have, as our government does a lot of things on our behalf that are confusing to the world, to say the least, that go against everything that we, the people, are for. We are the average American, no doubt. We don't want wars. We don't want famines. We don't want people killing each other. We don't want people starving out there. I have no doubt that we want for the other people what we want for ourselves. So the Muslim perspective of the world is that whatever story makes it to Western media is a story that is edited, shaped to form a certain opinion. And that stories that people in the Middle East, and specifically in the Muslim world, so since we're talking about Muslims here, the stories about America and Americans that we hear never make it to mainstream media in the US and Western media. We hear about a woman who decided in eastern Pakistan, 25 years old, Farzana, who decided that she didn't want to marry her cousin. And she married a man who was a widower. And her family killed her, an honor killing. It has been in the news for how long now? For about a week. It's a horrible crime. A horrible crime. Go see it in CNN. Go see it in Fox News. I encourage you to go and read it so you see how horrible the crime was. The story is there, and it stays there for a long time on CNN.com. The comments are sickening. The story had nothing to do with the faith of Islam or Muslims. It's tribal people who have weird, strange things. People around the world, tribes, have a lot of strange things about them. They do a lot of strange things. Tribes in Central America, in Africa, in Malaysia, Indonesia, in the Pacific Rim, for God's sake, they eat each other. They're cannibals. In Liberia, some of the generals, if you are not familiar with the story, General Butt Naked, this guy was absolutely his name, General Butt Naked, because he was butt naked with his soldiers when they went and fought. They used to eat an enemy child every single day to feed his soldiers. How outrageous, isn't it? But to them it was tribal, it's normal. Eating the flesh of your enemy, they don't do it for nutrition, they do it to show strength and pride. They believe that spiritually it makes them stronger. It's strange to all of us to hear all this stuff. Tribes do strange things. But where it becomes outrageous to Muslims is when the story is spun and you put someone always, the very first comment of thousands of comments, well, it's all, Muslims do this. And it doesn't matter, some Muslims and some reasonable people go there and try to explain, no, this has nothing to do with Muslims. But for every comment that is positive or reasonable, there are 100 or 200 that are just hate-filled. So Muslims read this stuff, and Muslims are absolutely suspicious and outrageous about this. Muslims do hear about the stories that happen in our cities. I remember one time, when I was growing up as a child, I used to love, and I still love, Western movies. Some of you have heard this before. And I remember watching a movie, Egyptian-produced movie, Egypt is the Hollywood of the Arab world, where cowboys were fighting and killing each other in the streets of Chicago. Now, we're from the Midwest. Please, for God's sake, laugh, because we know the cowboys do not exist in Chicago. Right? But that was the impression that I get. But also, I've heard people every time I go back there, please be careful. Where do you go to Minneapolis? Sometimes I go through Chicago. Oh my God. I mean, people are killing each other in the streets of Chicago. When I tell them downtown Chicago is one of the most beautiful cities. It is one of the most beautiful and safe downtowns. They actually do not believe me. Of course, they have a hard time believing me that we have 10,000 lakes that freeze in the winter. So there are many things that are put in their minds about our cities. 170 people die every year in the city of Miami. It's true. How many people die in the city of Minneapolis every year? Murder. About 60, 50, something. It reached 80. That's where we're at, right? How many of us truly actually see or experience or know about a personal story of something like that? We don't. It's a big city. It's a widespread city. We don't know anything about that. Yet in their minds, my God, 80 people die by gunshot every year there? When they get the statistics about the people who die because of drunk driving, they say, how do you drive there? Aren't you afraid somebody will drive? And it is a true fear that they experience. They believe that our schools are not safe anymore. Because how many stories did we have within the last 2 years of children having access to weapons and killing their classmates and sometimes their teachers? We hear the story. It goes in CNN and Fox News for a couple of days, but then we go on to something else. But those stories stay in their psyche, and that is the opinion that people in the Middle East and the Muslim world form of America. They have a lot of other unflattering things that they have about us. And when you as an American, or I as an American, say it is totally different than what you believe. Our streets are safe. I leave my house, my door to my house open. I wouldn't worry about it. We don't experience theft or burglary or any of that. They just do not believe what I'm telling them. I recently had a doctor who is a lieutenant colonel in the Jordanian Armed Forces, who is a physician, who came for an observership at the University of Minnesota for a year. And the first night he arrived, he stayed in our house, and he stayed in our basement, which is finished, so don't think that I was being hard, you know. And the door goes out, a walkout door to a pond and a nice yard. So I told him, by the way, it's really safe here. You don't have to worry about anything. He told me later that he was really terrified that night. He had absolutely no idea. He was expecting people to come and break through the windows and grab him and kill him. I live in Plymouth, for God's sake. These things don't happen. But in his psyche, that's different to him. I had another doctor, a professor, a Jordanian professor, who came and visited at one time. So we were sitting in our backyard, and he saw squirrels. I said, look at the squirrel, you know. And he said, are they dangerous? And he was really genuinely concerned. Are they going to attack us? He doesn't know. So the opinions that we form about each other are so misinformed that any story that we hear is not a complete story, or sometimes the story is misrepresented. An example of that is an event that happens almost on a daily basis in Gaza. In Gaza, if you hear about Israel bombing a car with 5 people in it, and if you happen to be watching Fox News for whatever reason, this is how you'd hear the news. The Israeli Defense Forces have bombed or rocketed a car with 5 suspected terrorists in it. The same piece of news would be told to people in the Middle East and the Muslim world as such, today the Zionist army, or some would say the occupiers, have bombed a Palestinian car with 5 innocent people in it. And by the way, they will always say using an American-made Apache helicopter. Always. You know, it's interesting. The facts are the same, but the words are not the same. And what's ironic, too, is that Fox News, which is owned, the largest shareholder is Murdoch. The second largest shareholder of Fox News is Prince Walid bin Talal of Saudi Arabia, who is the sole owner of MBC, which broadcasts 10 channels out of London in Arabic, and it is the most anti-American news network in the world in Arabic. It's ironic, the world that we live in. So what is going on? Now, it is easy for us. It really is easy, and the easiest thing for the world. I wish we lived in a world that is black and white. I really did. I really do. I'm colorblind, by the way, so it's easy for me. Every day I beg my wife, honey, please, can you match these clothes for me? Because many times I don't know what I'm putting together, right? So it makes it easy for me because I can delegate to my wife, who's always loving and she always helps me. Living in a world that's black and white is a lot easier, believe it or not. And it would have been easy if we were always the good guys and the people on the other side are always the bad guys. It's not. Even in the Muslim world, there are many different factions who are against each other. Unlike us in the West, because we always get along, right? So in the Muslim world, one of the most menacing regimes, by far, is a regime that is one of our best friends, and that is the Saudi regime. The Saudi monarchy is one of the most menacing regimes, I really would dare say, in the world, because they fund many of the most notorious movements out there that are leaders of terrorism and strange things. Remember, I just told you a minute ago that in 2011, the US government threatened the Nigerian government with economic sanctions if they would go after Boko Haram? This is why. Boko Haram, the word Boko Haram, are part of a slogan, a political slogan that started back when the British occupied Nigeria, colonized Nigeria. So at that time, what the British did is they split Nigeria into 2 virtual communities, the South and the North. And in the South, they had an experiment led by the Anglican Church of Christianizing the population. And part of that is that they turned a lot of people, they gave them names, English names. Victoria is one of the most common names in Africa. Peter, John, David, all of those are very common names in the southern part of Nigeria because the British were there. And at the same time, with the naming, with the forcing of new names on people, they introduced curriculum that would teach math, would teach physics, would teach economics, but also would teach Anglican Christianity. So a movement started that had a political slogan, Boko Haram. It's a sin to learn, to go to schools that would teach, force us to learn, or force people who were Muslims and others, by the way, there were a lot of pagans at the time, first others, to learn about a faith that they don't adhere to. That slogan stayed in place until the middle 80s and the early 90s, where it turned into an armed conflict led by Wahhabi Islam, which is funded by Saudi Arabia. The leader of Boko Haram studied in Saudi Arabia. He's supported by Saudi Arabia. So when our government tried, actually our government, I really believe genuinely, doesn't want to see that conflict there. So when the Nigerian government tried to put an end to the Boko Haram phenomenon, which was ransacking the countryside, destroying mosques, churches, villages, kidnapping girls, killing a lot of people, our government, by pressure by Saudi lobby, which, by the way, is one of the most influential lobbies in the US, our government backed off. Our government was told with lobbyists in Washington. And if you go to Washington, I will give you the address of one of the largest lobby groups that is completely funded by the Saudis, that lobbies on behalf of the Saudi government. We do not dare do a lot of things without the Saudis' blessing. I know it sounds really strange. Don't believe me. Who's our defense Secretary of Defense now? Chuck Hagel. Just go buy his book. Chuck owes me because I'm making an advertisement for his book. Go buy his book and read what he says in his book. He says exactly what I'm saying. Chuck Hagel in his book states clearly, he said that I was sitting with the king of Saudi Arabia who was telling me, you need to nuke Iran. You need to send American forces and just nuke Iran. He said, I felt like we were mercenaries for the Saudis. And it's complicated. Why do we listen to them? It's very complicated. I'd like to say because we're morons, but we're not. It is complicated. There are a lot of economic, political issues behind this power that the Saudis have. The same thing when we look at the Syrian conflict. The Syrian conflict, the U.S. is taking the side of the Saudis and the Qataris in this. While it doesn't really make sense for us to do that. The Syrians demonstrated in the city of Daraa against their government. And all of a sudden there is a civil war where 140,000 people are dead. That's what we hear. We hear that Bashar al-Assad is a tyrant, and indeed he is. He's a tyrant, and his father was a tyrant. And they have ruled Syria for over 50 years. But we were okay with that tyrant. What happened now that we changed our minds? Saudi Arabia has 33,000 fighters in Syria. Saudi Arabia, actually, in their media, in their TV stations and newspapers, call for democratic elections in Syria. How ironic. It's an absolute monarchy in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia funds its own groups. Saudi Arabia funds a group that's called Al-Nusra, or the Al-Qaeda of the Levant. One of the most brutal networks out there. So the Saudis fund their own group, 33,000 Saudis. Thousands of Jordanians, thousands of Europeans, some Americans. Just 2 days ago, a kid who grew up in Florida, but I think was born in New Jersey, blew himself up. An American kid blew himself up in Syria. Sad. From his picture, he looks so innocent. He was holding his cat, smiling. I'll tell you, I teach at a college. I know this type. He is so innocent and gullible. Somebody convinced him that he should go there. And I can tell you, it's not the U.S. government. Some mosque leader, some imam convinced him, this is a good thing, go for jihad, you'll go to heaven. And he went there and he blew himself up. I feel bad for the people he killed. I feel bad for his parents. I feel bad for him. But you know who I feel bad for? I feel bad for us. Because I know that Al-Nusra intends to come and attack us in our own cities. How do I know? Because I know Arabic, and I go to YouTube and I see their own videos saying after liberating Syria, we're attacking American cities. Qatar funds a different group. It's called ISIS, which is even more brutal. So Al-Qaeda version and Al-Qaeda version A and B, they hate each other. They're fighting each other, but this one is funded by this government and this one is funded by this other government. ISIS killed over 700,000 Iraqis since its inception. This is outrageous. It's outrageous to Muslims. According to the United Nations, 2012, 98% of the victims of terrorism by these groups were Muslims. So when Muslims say, oh, all Muslims do this, the common Muslim is absolutely outraged because we are not the terrorists. In fact, we are the #1 victims of terrorism. We are the #1 victims of potential terrorism in the U.S. I remember September 11. I remember that day, dreadful day, clearly. I'll never forget it. I was stunned. I was going to lead my employees in a meeting, and one of the employees said, "Did you hear about the plane that crashed into the World Trade Center?" And how many of you are from St. Paul, downtown St. Paul? There is a World Trade Center there, so that's where my mind went to. There is an airport. And I said, "Oh, I hope nobody was hurt." He said, "No, you don't get it. It's in Washington, D.C." And of course, the events unfolded. CNN posted a video of Palestinian children celebrating. How many of you seen that? Many of us have heard about that. The video is still out there. Palestinian children are happy that 3,000 Americans died. It's really outrageous. Myself and a group of Muslim leaders challenged CNN and said, "Where did you get this video? Where did you get this video?" Because the warplanes hit on September 11 at, roughly speaking, 8 a.m., between 8 a.m. and 8:15. At that time, it was nighttime in Palestine. How did they get a video where daytime, where children are celebrating? CNN was good enough to apologize. On their website, CNN.com, in small print, for 20 minutes at 7 a.m. in the morning. And they said, "You're absolutely right. This video was not, it had nothing to do with September 11. So it's all conditioned. This is how the Muslims view the world, the general Muslims. What we Muslims feel and believe is that the world should come to our help to fight terrorism, and we would be the front line soldiers. You'd hear about the Boston bombers. The number one community that feels the fear of something like that are the Muslims, because my children, my wife, is free and she goes anywhere. She goes. I can't keep her though. She's just gets in the car and she's always all over the place. And I like to stay home or stay in my office. I really worry about her. I really worry about somebody who is a nutcase who would blame her for what's going on somewhere else, for the actions of some lunatics out there. As it is not fair for somebody overseas to blame Christianity for the actions of the Army of God in South Sudan, or the Christian militia in Central African Republic, or indeed for even the wrong things that the U.S. government does overseas. The American people are really innocent bystanders with all of this. We think that we elect. We have a choice of two people, either Republicans or Democrats. Either this guy or that guy. It hasn't been this guy or that girl yet, right? And many times we know that our presidents are, in effect, they're figureheads. President Obama, I voted for President Obama. I had a lot of hope, the audacity of hope. We know that President Obama could not fulfill many, many of the promises that he made to us. Neither could President Bush, the first or the second, or Clinton or Reagan or anybody, because we know our economic, political system. We understand it. The world doesn't understand that. I've heard from people overseas who, when I made this argument to them, they said, "Wait a minute. It's a government by the people and for the people." I wish they know how it is somewhat by the people. It certainly is not, from my perspective, for the people. I can talk on and on. I can talk about the Ukraine, but hopefully some of you will ask me. But I've been given my note to stop here. So I'll stop here, and I hope that you have a lot of questions, because I know there are a lot of conflicts and a lot of news out there. So with this, I'll stop. Thank you.
Just a couple of notes. Just a couple of notes. Mr. Muhawesh will pick the persons who ask the question, and wait for the microphone. I should be quick. So give me a couple of seconds.
Any questions? Go ahead, please.
You've mentioned a variety of terrorist groups, the Army of God and some others. Is there any kind of violence ranking as far as which are the most obscene or whatever? I mean, it sounds like there are so many groups. And
among the Muslim groups or the Christian groups? Or
well, among any groups. I mean, whether they're even religiously affiliated or not. They're just terrorist groups.
ISIS, anything that's associated with Al-Qaeda is absolutely violent and beyond imagination, beyond anything that we can even envision. being Midwesterners, especially because we're peaceful people. You look at the war crimes that were committed by the phalangists, the Lebanese phalangists in the 80s. Those were really, really brutal. I know for a fact that they burnt children alive to make an example for other people. In what happened in Bosnia, the killing of ethnic killing, basically, is really outrageous. Humans are ugly. We unfortunately are capable of doing some of the ugliest things that we can. What I caution, though, is that we shouldn't be complacent. One of my students who was joining the Air Force as a bomber came and wanted to talk to me. He said, "What is your perspective? How do I feel with this morally?" And I said, I don't know. I don't know how you can deal with yourself, firing, pushing the button for a missile that you don't know where it's going and who is going to be in the other end of this missile. What is dangerous for us is that we don't see the enemy. In martial arts, I'll give you an example. In martial arts, in karate, they say when you have an opponent, don't ever look them in the eye. Because if you look them in the eye, you will feel their life. And if you feel their life, you cannot harm them. They will win against you. I'm afraid, I worry about our advancements, that we get to that level where we're too advanced to see the eyes of the people that we harm. So I just worry that we give ourselves an upper moral judgment over others. Well, are we really better than others when we kill? I don't like killing. I am a theologian, but also a businessman. I think the way to take the world on is by debate in theology and by trade. And may the best man or woman win. There is no need to kill. The world can take all of us. There are people do strange things to each other in what's going on in the Ukraine. And by the way, I was given a lesson recently by somebody who was in the Ukraine. He said it's a mistake and you're taking a political side when you say the Ukrainians. Pro-Russians say the Ukrainians. And Americans and people who are pro the Ukraine government are supposed to say the Ukraine because it's one country. So that's a political lesson that I learned. So anyway, those groups, the pictures that are coming from the Central African Republic of a young man, he's in his early 20s, knives being held to his throat. I believe his name was Yahya, which translates to John. He's a Muslim. He's waiting for the army to take, the militias to cut off his head. And they took pictures of him before they did that. The look in his eyes is absolutely just beyond description. I don't know how you can describe it. But isn't any violence against people violence? Aren't the two girls who were raped and hanged in India, regardless of if they were lower caste or upper caste or Hindu or Muslim or I don't care whether, isn't that violence? Isn't the violence our school kids? I mean, we worry about our schools now. School kids are taking guns and shooting up each other. Violence is violence at the end of the day. But some violence seems to be more outrageous. And I would think that Al-Qaeda wins that battle hands down.
When you talk about that, we need to look at what, the other side of the story. What are some of your recommendations of how we find that out, other than calling you?
It's a very good question. The thing is, when you go to the Middle East, they have one-sided stories too. It's as if there is a deliberate effort to make people hate the other side. Now, it could be commercial. It could be because that's what sells, right? But our news media here do not really serve us. I really don't care about the owner of the Clippers, of what he does to them. Is it the Clippers or the Rockets? Clippers. I don't really could care less if he sues that team or if he gets sued or if he makes $2 billion or $1 billion. I want to know about the issues that matter to us. I think the biggest news, did you see this kid who blew himself up? He's an American and said, this is going to be the biggest news here. It wasn't. It wasn't until somebody asked the State Department, they said, oh yeah, he's an American. We don't have any more information. That should be news that terrifies us. Because how many of those kids, and I really mean innocent kids, when they have been brainwashed and come back with guerrilla warfare skills to come back and blow us up. So it's difficult to get a whole collective news. There is a lot of alternative media. The Huffington Post is another one that I would read. I don't believe everything that the Huffington Post says. I don't believe RT.com, by the way, Russia Today, is the largest and most influential news network in the world. On YouTube alone, their channel is followed by 1 billion people. Of course, they have a Russian agenda. But you know, I hope that we have enough intelligence to watch Fox News. And I have a lot of friends of mine who say, really watch Fox News? Yes, I do. You know, so they have watch Fox News, watch CNN, watch MSNBC. So CNN is supposed to be in the middle. It's not. But we all know Fox News is the most American and the most honest news network out there, right? And of course, if you're on the other side of the spectrum, MSNBC is the most honest news network. We always get news that is spun so that we can be influenced. Watch all of them if you have time. I know it is hard to do. I know it is very difficult to do. But if you really, truly want to understand those issues that matter to you, search. Look at these different news networks and get a complete picture and form your own opinion. We will not, I will guarantee you, we will not get unbiased news from anybody. So the onus is on us as individuals, as a collective community, to try to understand what is really going on. Because if we don't, we will get stuck in wars that we had absolutely no business doing. Our kids will go and fight and die in wars that absolutely have no value to anybody. Not us, not the people where we go. No, nobody would benefit from those wars. We don't want our money to do that. We don't want our people to do that. Yes, I believe that if people attack us and attacks our nation, we have every right to defend ourselves. But my goodness, if you haven't heard about false flag operations, read about them. Just 2 months ago, the Turkish government, a video was leaked of the prime minister, the head of their intelligence, and the defense minister discussing sending soldiers across the border to Syria dressed as Syrian soldiers and have them attack Turkey so Turkey has a pretext to go inside and occupy a part of Syria. False flag operations. They plague us. You had a question.
Where would you put Al Jazeera on the continuum of authenticity of news?
Al Jazeera, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being one of the most fabricated networks, is an 11. Al Jazeera is one of the worst out there. I do not believe, and there is no difference for me between Al Jazeera and CNN, by the way, is devious about the way they do their news. They really are devious. Fox News is not devious. They're just dumb and they just tell you what's in their minds, right? Right? So, but CNN is devious. Al Jazeera is devious as well. Al Jazeera is dangerous because it has so much funding behind it. And now they're on cable, in our cable channel. And they are being billed as alternative media. Not so. Al Jazeera had played big roles in creating bloodshed in the Middle East and around the world. I don't believe Al Jazeera. But having said that, I'd say watch Al Jazeera. Form your own opinions. They did a documentary recently about immigration that actually changed my opinion about a lot of immigration issues. I'll share my opinion with you. I used to say, hey, we have a process. I applied through the process. It took me years to become a citizen. I'm proud to be a citizen. Everybody should do the same thing. I watched that documentary, which was a series of they sent people who were like me, people who were immigration advocates, and everybody in between. And I watched their journey, and they completely changed my mind. It is a totally different story than what I thought. So they do have documentaries like that. But when it comes to reporting on the news, tell me what's the difference between them and CNN. They're the same. And by the way, Arabic Al Jazeera is vastly different. Vastly different. That is so anti-American. But they are two different organizations. Keep that in mind. Go ahead, please.
No problem. More recently, we've heard in the news about the Uyghur minority in China and violence attributed to them. Now, the link in the media was these were Muslim Chinese who were attacking. And I'm just curious if this is more a tribal issue within China or if this is actually faith-based type of an activity that's being funded internally, externally?
Yeah. No, the history of the Chinese Muslims goes way back to the advent of Islam, and certain groups were demonized. And actually, for us who are not familiar with Chinese culture, many times we don't know that even Chinese movies and martial arts movies specifically demonize the Muslims without us paying attention. For instance, they would show always the bad guys wearing certain garments. To us, we can't tell the difference, but those bad guys are always Muslims. So there is that kind of demonization of Muslims, but that aspect of it was specifically tribal. The recent events that you're hearing out there are actually religious-based. The Chinese Muslims, before the rise of Wahhabi Islam, were some of the most peaceful Muslims. In fact, they were almost Buddhist Muslims in their monk-style living. They were Sufis. They were Hanafi Sufis. Very peaceful inclination. Now, Wahhabi Islam, unfortunately, made its way there. See, when the Chinese government prevented them from building their mosques, the Saudis stepped in. And they started building their mosques, and they volunteered some imams from Saudi Arabia or graduates from the Saudi institutions. And that's where all trouble started. This is exactly what is happening. That's a very astute question from you. There are 200 million Chinese Muslims. And I actually believe that the future of China is troublesome in that region, because Wahhabi Islam is spreading between them. That is not unlike Pakistan. We hear all the strange and bad and horrible stories that are coming out of Pakistan today. Pakistan, until 1972, was the model Muslim country. A lot of tolerance. The form of Islam that they had there, they had several forms. Mostly were Sufi-leaning and Shias. They got along. They had absolutely no problems. Christians lived in peace. Everybody, Hindus, Buddhists lived in peace there. Until 1972, the Saudis sent a delegation to, I believe it is Karachi or Lahore. No, I believe it's Karachi, where they built King Faisal Mosque. Beautiful mosque, a massive mosque. That mosque changed Pakistan, made Pakistan into the lawless land that it is today. Because they sent, with the mosque, they sent a lot of teachers. And those teachers taught Wahhabi Islam, which is so intolerant of anybody else. And there are many reasons, by the way, why the Saudis would take this brand of Islam while they can't take other brands of Islam, by the way. They have enough money to do that. There are many reasons, and that would need another lecture, actually, why the Saudis take this. And it makes, from a mathematical perspective, it makes sense. But from a moral perspective, it's a crime. I hope I answered your question.
I noticed that you haven't mentioned either National Public Radio News or PBS News here locally. I'm curious as to what you think about them.
Good question. NPR and PBS are both great organizations. They really are. I listen to them. They are victims like us of partial news, unfortunately. And they are not, if you remember last year, they were almost shut down by Congress because they're government subsidized and publicly funded. That's because they were viewed as have taken a side in a certain conflict, and they were almost shut down. I'm glad they were not, because they are a good source of information or news. But they're really small, they're minor. And many times their reporters who go around the world are underpaid. They're not your top-tier reporters, and they are not really informed about the issues that they cover. So what they do is they default to the mainstream perspective of things. And that mainstream perspective of things is more often than not is false. It's not true. But, who else do you listen to? We can listen to sports all day long. What chances do we have?
With regard to labels and what we hear, we talk about Christianity, but everybody understands there's Catholics and Protestants and so on. Do you think it would help in news reporting if they started referring to Wahhabi Islam and then just Islam?
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, it's keep it simple for the public.
Absolutely.
And just adding that one word might.
It's exactly right, because there are massive differences between these sects amongst each other. Their view of the world, politics, theology, canon, they're vastly different. As there are many differences between Christian sects. But when it comes to politics, these differences become more defined. You know, a good example of that, Christians killed each other, 30 million in Europe alone. They only were able to do that when politics were introduced, right? And that is what the Muslim world is experiencing today. These are, from my perspective, if Wahhabis want to believe that I'm going to hell, they can believe that. I don't really care. I know they believe that, by the way. You know, I know all of us are going to hell except for them. You know, heaven would be really a boring place, by the way. Okay. You know, so they can believe that day in and day out. Some Christians believe I'm going to hell, right? A lot of people would think any of us are going to hell all the time. That doesn't bother me. It bothers me when people think that I'm not worthy of living because I do not believe exactly as they believe in. So, I wish that our media would make sure that there is a clear distinction that all of those, bar none, all of those terrorist attacks are carried by a very specific, narrow, well-defined Muslim sect that arose in the 17th century.
And would that be the simple way to do it, just Islam versus Wahhabism?
That's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is. Oops, I'm sorry, go ahead.
As we spoke to our son about coming here today, he thought it would be interesting because he wanted to know what the ordinary Muslim thought, because we know what the ordinary Christian thought. And I think that's exactly what you're telling us. You're speaking to us. We're being educated well. And you've given us some ways to continue to educate ourselves. What else can we do? I mean, I don't think anybody in this room can fund things like the Saudis do.
Yeah.
But what else can we do to really change this perspective?
You know, and thank you for asking that question. It shows that you care, and thank you. The biggest enemy that we have is ignorance. It really is. And sometimes we laugh at that ignorance, but it's so dangerous. I think some of you have heard me say this about my mother. My mother is a great, loving woman. She came in the early 80s here to visit us. We used to live in an apartment building, and our neighbor lost her child, so she came knocking the door. She said, "Did you see?" And I don't remember her girl's name. And so we said, "No, we don't." You know, everybody went around to help her, and she found her. My mother was absolutely amazed. She said, "I didn't think that Christian women cared about their kids." You know, the reaction that you have is, what? What are you talking about? You know, of course we love our kids. But that is constant indoctrination, constant creation of fear. You know, so we have to fight ignorance. We have to look for news. For instance, this woman in Sudan, by the way, nothing is going to happen to her. It is going to be a news story that will be for public consumption for a while to come. And she will become a public figure. She will travel to the US or Europe, and she will become a mouthpiece against Islam. That's what happens with people like that. But how about Batul Haddad? Any of you have heard about Batul Haddad? Even the Muslims, have you heard about her? Batul Haddad, you heard about her from me probably. Right? Batul Haddad was a Jordanian girl, 21 years old, 2 weeks ago, who grew up as a Christian, and she converted to Islam. Her father and uncle killed her because of that. And it's not because she became a Muslim, quote unquote, because Christians in Jordan fast with us. They pray with us. In fact, for the most part, they're Muslims, but they're different tribes, so they say we're Christian because she abandoned the tribe. They say because she became a Muslim, but that's really not the reason, you know? And if we don't hear, so we will never hear about her story. You'll never hear about her story because it doesn't serve. It's not going to be good for public consumption. The story of that Maryam Ibrahim, is good for, you know, inciting hate and inciting fear and inciting, demonization of the other. So we will hear about that story. It's unfortunate. We have to educate ourselves. And how do we educate ourselves? In Minnesota, for God's sake, we don't have a lot of options, right? But we do have some events that are going on. We have the Muslim Christian Dialogue Center at the University of St. Thomas, which has done a great job. Until recently, the co-director and founder, Dr. Terry Nichols, passed away to cancer. This is a great loss for humanity. This man was a true prophet of peace. He really was. But, you know, with God's will, we will continue the efforts there. We hold a lot of programs. There are many other organizations that hold programs, like IRC, the Islamic Resource Group, that holds speeches. They do
Media,
somewhat.
man.
Yeah, and I'm coming to the best one, actually. Just wait, okay? Yeah, so locally, buy a book, read about Islam, but, don't read books that are designed to create hate. If you want to learn about Jews, go get a book that was written by a rabbi. If you want to read about Buddhists, go find a book that's written by the Dalai Lama or by a monk. If you want to read about Protestant Christians, that's where you go. And about Islam, it's the same thing. Start with some books. For God's sake, if nothing else, go read the book written by a Jewish professor. I remember the name of the book, and it's easy to remember. It's called Jefferson's Quran. You will find great connections between Islam and our own constitution. So there are a lot of things, and as one TV commercial said, just go to the internet doesn't lie, right? Having said this, Islamic media, and I'm really serious about this, holds programs, and hopefully they'll hold more programs. I'll be more than honored to come and speak, and there are a lot of other good speakers who will speak too. Listen to other people. Listen to a diverse Muslim perspective, because my perspective is one perspective. I wish I can speak for 1.6 billion Muslims. I don't. But it's reflective of some Muslims, or a collective thinking of Muslims, I'd like to think. Does that make sense?
In the interest of sort of pulling on the thread that you started earlier about whose interests sort of serve behind the scenes. So whose interests are actually served in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Obviously, someone's interests keep that alive. The same thing, I guess, maybe it's a slightly different thread, but then whose interests are also served in the ongoing Sunni-Shia conflicts? I mean, those are not, there's got to be another common piece there somewhere, doesn't there?
Yeah. Well, you asked me about a question that nobody has been able to solve so far. but somebody interest, in many, see, we have a great political system in the U.S., but it's flawed. And the biggest flaw that we have in our system, aside from the two political party system, I have an issue with it. We should really have a true democracy. We don't, but it's a function, somewhat functioning democracy, right? One of the biggest challenges that we have in our political system is something that's constitutional, the right to petition our elected officials. Those words have affected us in more negative ways than we can imagine, because that gave us the right to form lobbies. Just 2 weeks ago, I went to Washington, D.C., and next to me sat a gentleman, burly farmer, who is the president of the Lamb Association of Minnesota. I learned everything that you want to know about sheep and lamb. And he's going there for several days to go and lobby on the rights of lamb farmers. Great. But we have a lot of other lobbies. We have a lobby for alcohol and tobacco. We have a lobby for the right of gun ownership. We have a lobby for everything that you can imagine. That's okay. It's not okay when it becomes the way to legislate. It's not okay when it becomes the way to create laws. That's where our system fails us. When it comes to foreign policy, which is where your question is, we have the same problem. Today, the two most powerful lobbies in DC are the Israeli lobby and the Saudi lobby. And they are both as powerful in our government, in federal government. If it was up to me, and I guarantee it's not up to me, we would eliminate all lobbies. We elect an official, they go and they represent our opinions, not the lobby's opinions. If you haven't educated yourself about the power of lobbies out there, I highly recommend that you do. I really highly recommend that you do. And no, it is not the Jewish interest that is represented in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is the Israeli lobby's conflict. I know this from very close Jewish friends rabbis and professors and doctors and well-educated Israelis who tell me about the power of the Israeli lobby in their own synagogues, in all throughout the nation. So it is really the lobby's interest. The lobby's interest that supersedes the Jewish interest and the American interest in all of those conflicts. We poured $500 billion in 60 years in that small piece of land. What is ROI? What is return on investment? It's terrible. It's nothing. But yet we cannot question. We cannot even say this. We cannot question ourselves about it. And the second conflict that you asked me about was the Sunni Shia. Sunni Shia divide is a very easy one to understand. You control Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. You control the Muslim psyche. In order for you to control Mecca and Medina, you have to have a well-funded, well-studied school of thought. If you allow diverse understanding of Islam, as Islam really is very diverse, because it's a reflection of humanity too, then you lose control over that. Everybody, from the advent of Islam until this day, understood the importance of control over Mecca and Medina. Mecca and Medina were in the hands of different Sunni schools from the time of the death of the Prophet until the Abbasid Caliphate fell apart. The Ottomans took over. As long as the Ottomans were in control, Muslims viewed them as legitimate throughout. And they supported them, and they felt that they truly are our representatives. England, the English, completely understood this. And they went after specifically Mecca and Medina and helped the Wahhabi clan with the Saud clan to take over it. And the Ottoman Empire didn't last long after that. So now, the Saudis know that the rise in power within the Muslim world, there are some geographic aspects to this, are the Shias. The reason being is that 80% of oil and oil fields in the Muslim world are under Shia control, including Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, the oil fields, for those of you who know Saudi Arabia, the oil fields are in the eastern province, which is Shia. It's throughout Shia. Kuwait, the oil fields, it's an oil field for the most part, a lot of Shias. Iran, even Azerbaijan, which is a breakaway from the Soviet republics, it's about 95% Shia. So the Saudis see this, and they don't want they don't want that power to permeate throughout the Muslim world. So it's like nothing that we have seen. The propaganda, the Shia-Sunni propaganda pitting one against another. It's reminiscent of what took place between Catholics and Protestants in Europe. You know, I think probably over 1 million people have died so far. God forbid, I would not be surprised if we reach the 30 million mark. Because there is a lot of money, a lot of media, a lot of demonization that is taking place. And that is only to tell people, do not side with the Shias, do not side with Iran, side with us. We are the Sunnis like you. And it's really equivalent to an extremist Christian sect. And I'm sure you can think of yourself, who would stand in front of people and tell families of soldiers, your kids are going to heaven. And our veterans are going to go to hell, along with gay people and other people, right? So just imagine if that sect had enough willpower and enough money, money like the Saudi money behind it, to speak on behalf of all Christians. That's exactly what the problem that we have in Islam today.
From your perspective, we're all listening to what's good and what's bad, and there's much more bad than there's good. From the Islamic perspective, worldwide, what is there to be hopeful about? The enemy is human nature. The enemy, perhaps, is something we can't change. Why do you believe your following can bring optimism and peace to the world?
Great question, because that's what it teaches. We hear bad stories. We hear about the kid in California who decided that girls do not want to date him, and he decided to have a day of retribution. Do you have any doubt that at that same school there was a kid who brought cookies for all the students? Or at that same school there were a lot of great events? The Muslim world is full of greatness, a lot of great stories. And the Muslim world has a lot of solutions that we should take example of. The Muslim world doesn't have an alcoholism problem. The Muslim world doesn't have drunk driving problems. Divorce in the Muslim world is one of the lowest in the world. Safety, in spite of what we hear, safety in the streets, help families one another. We do not even compare to what goes on in the Muslim world, throughout the Muslim world. What we hear are negative stories. And no, I do not believe there is more evil than good in the world. I believe that there is a lot more good in the world than evil. We just don't hear about it. News media don't have any interest on reporting on a girl who brought Girl Scout cookies and gave them away for free to all the kids. You even never hear that in CNN or Fox News. But you'll hear about a kid who shot up other people. You'll hear about terrible stories. For every story you hear from the Muslim world, that unfortunate 25-year-old Farzana who was killed by her parents for honor killing, we have horrible stories here, but they are not spun that way. Or they are not covered in the media. We have a lot of horrible stories that take place in Minnesota, Wisconsin. We don't hear people in the Middle East or in the Muslim world, people eating other people, like Jeffrey Dahmer. We don't hear about cannibalism. We don't hear about, and this is really not, I'm not trying to demonize my brothers and sisters who are Christian, for instance, but we don't hear about priest molestation of children, thousands of them. So it depends on what we like to see or what we want to see. We can see the ugliest side of each other. We truly can. And that's what we are looking at. In the Muslim world, they're looking at the West, who is very powerful, the largest navy, the largest, very influential in the United Nations. They can make anything they want legal, and they can kill us in the name of law. They can do economic sanctions and starve us to death. They can do a lot of things. And in the West, we hear about these lunatics who are going around blowing themselves up, killing other people. What kind of faith is that? Look deep inside the faiths. You'll find them to be exactly the same. Exactly the same. Yeah, we differ about the divinity of Jesus. But we both love Jesus as the Messiah, for instance. We both, speaking of hope, we both long to the day that Jesus comes back to establish the kingdom of peace and the kingdom of God, because that is a Muslim belief. That's what Muslims look forward to. Muslims have done a lot of horrible things. So did Christians. In fact, if you want to count one-on-one, Christians have done a lot more horrible things. That is no right for Muslims to demonize Christianity over this. Nor is it a right for Christians to demonize all Muslims over this. What the teachings are of Christianity and Islam, which account for over 2/3 of the world population, the teachings themselves are absolutely beautiful. I cannot sleep with a full stomach if my neighbor is hungry. And this is not your physical neighbor, your human neighbor. This is a Muslim teaching. I cannot be a Muslim if I do not give charity. If there are orphans who are needy in the world. These are Christian values. The values are exactly the same. Truth-telling, courage, nobility, all those are exactly the same values. I will never believe that if somebody believes that Jesus is God or the Son of God, they are not worthy of living. And I hope that nobody should ever believe that I believe Muhammad is the messenger of God, that I'm not worthy of living or I'm worthy of hate. This is ridiculous. We need to come back to our humanity. And if we come back to our humanity, that's where we see the hope. The teachings are exactly the same. I really believe, as a Muslim, and as a devout Muslim, I like to think, that what unifies us more than anything else is Jesus. Jesus, as a Muslim, is the Messiah. Jesus is the one who will establish the kingdom of God. Yes, he will have an army of Muslims, according to my teachings, led by a descendant of Prophet Muhammad, the Mahdi, if you haven't heard about him, they will come together and they will fix us. They'll fix everything that is going on. I hope and I pray that I could live to see that day. The world is not going to be fixed by Christians alone, because they haven't been able to get along. Let's not fool ourselves and think that Christians have gotten along all along. This is recent. What you see, the harmony that you see in Christianity, is very, very recent. Christians have a bloody history. And the bloodiness that you see between Muslims is very recent. It's not even 20 years old. So I have hope, and I really believe, as a person who is hopefully one of the leaders of dialogue, that Muslims and Christians can come together, and Jews, and Buddhists, and atheists and every human being to say, yeah, I have a different opinion, but guess what? I hate it when it's cold outside. I hate mosquitoes. I like fishing. I like nice weather. I like to go on a picnic, and I love my neighbors regardless of who they are. That's the hope that we have for. I believe that the world has a lot more goodness in it, but we talk about the bad in the world. We never talk about the good in the world.
We still have room for a couple questions. We still have room for a couple questions. The lunch is being prepared. So after you.
I just want to make a quick comment. We, unfortunately, in this busy world, we don't have time to do everything that we'd like to do, and we're going to have to leave. But just wanted to say this. My wife and I are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons, and we have neighbors that are Muslim, and that is what has brought us here, was knowing these people and wanting to know more about them. And what you have done here today has really filled my mind with some comfort and a stronger desire to learn more. And I appreciate it. I know my wife appreciates it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I happen to know your neighbors, and they are terrible people. Your neighbors, Saleh has been a friend of mine since I was 18 years old. So I've known him for a long time. I don't know where he went. He probably took his lunch and escaped.
They're having a baby.
Oh, they're having a baby. Oh,
Grandbaby.
Congratulations. Oh, my God. Not them. Their children are, absolutely. Yeah, they're too old to have a baby, I was going to say. But I know. They're wonderful people. And by the way, I just want to tell you this. I know you have to go, but I'll just give you this. Mormon believers in the Islamic faith are called mu'min. So the word is very close. And if anybody can understand the problems and the demonization that we're going through, it's you guys. So thank you for being here. Thank you.
One final question.
I think we had a question here.
You mentioned the Israeli lobby in Washington and the Saudi lobby. And I know the Israeli lobby is primarily there for the Israeli government, but there are also other groups like, J Street and some others that are
Yes.
much more modest, and they're not necessarily supportive of the Israeli government. What are the equivalents on the Saudi, or on, I should say, on the, there's the Saudi lobby, which is especially for Saudi Arabia, which in turn has the fallout. What are the groups that are sort of in that camp, but not like the Saudi lobby?
The Saudi or Israeli, you mean?
Well, yeah, they're very strong for the Saudi government, Israeli government,
Yes.
whatnot.
There is a very weak Cuban lobby, believe it or not. Very weak, very unsupported. Europe has some presence, but it's really not that strong.
Yeah, I guess what I'm asking, though, are there other groups like representing the Middle East, but not the Wasabi Islam position?
I see. No, they're not. There are embassies who act as lobbying groups. The Turks are very strong in Washington, D.C. They have strong presence. The Iraqi government is actually putting together a lobby that, if they come through, will become a very effective lobby. And I know this firsthand because I was actually contacted by the Iraqi government for some consultation. So they are putting a lot of money to put, lawyers and lobbyists, and that's a big industry, unfortunately, in Washington, D.C. And to me, that is like a drug that we're allowing to operate in D.C. I really, truly have a big issue with these lobbies, convincing our legislators to legislate not on behalf of us, the people who vote for our elected officials, but on behalf of these lobbies. And it is, at the end of the day, it is money. Lobbyists, some of the lobbyists were interviewed recently, and one of them said, hey, don't think that we go after, congressmen and senators. He said, they come after us all the time. Pelosi, look at her record, regardless of what you think of her. She actually spent more time having dinners and meetings with lobbies than on the floor. That should be something for us. As American people who influence the whole world, our decisions influence all of humanity. We cannot be complacent about this. Are we done? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I appreciate the questions. Thank you.
Just a couple remarks. we're going to reset the tables. As you leave, get your lunch behind those doors. We will try to arrange the tables so we face each other while we have lunch. And we'll try as much as possible to have a volunteer, a Muslim volunteer, for any further questions you might have. And when you are ready to leave, the tables now, they have lots of free gifts, books, CDs, DVDs. Please don't feel guilty to take all of them. Some of them, there are specifically for you. And about email, we do many unconventional ways to reach you. I think a few of you have noticed that. If you leave your email, we promise you that we will never share it with anyone, and you will get from us at most one email a year. At most one email a year.